Recording in progress.
Well, I'm going to begin with two parallel readings. The first is from the 5th chapter of Amos. You can also find a version of this reading in the back of our hymnal if it strikes you. O you who turn justice to wormwood and cast down righteousness to the earth, I hate, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them, and the peace offerings of your fatted beasts I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs, to the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So I invite you to see if you see the parallel in this reading from Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of the land. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. Never was there a clearer case of stealing the livery of the court of heaven to serve the devil in. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show, together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master. Revivals of religion and revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. The slave prison and the church stand near each other. The clanking of fetters and the rattling of chains in the prison and the pious psalm and solemn prayer in the church may be heard at the same time. The dealers in the bodies of men erect their stand in the presence of the pulpit, and they mutually help each other. The dealer gives his blood-stained gold to support the pulpit, and the pulpit, in return, covers his infernal business with the garb of Christianity. Here we have religion and robbery, the allies of each other, devils dressed in angels' robes, and hell presenting the semblance of paradise. I suspect that there are parallels in our current hypocrisies, and perhaps David Gamble can illuminate some of them for us. So David graciously agreed to join us this morning to talk about race and racism in our community, and perhaps more broadly. And someone's going to fix our Zoom. Thank you, Leah. David has lived in Reno more or less since the age of 2. Apparently growing up near relatives of Jenny. He came to Reno when his father relocated from Pittsburgh to the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Justices to train judges in the handling of domestic violence cases. And I think David must have inherited some of his father's passion for justice. I see a smile from the second row. Very good. He graduated from UNR in journalism and then went on to law school, Thomas Jefferson Law School in San Diego. He served in Harry Reid's Reno the Senate office, and then went to DC himself to work for the Social Security Administration for a period of time. He came back to Reno to work in the Washoe County Public Defender's Office, dealing again with domestic violence cases, as a matter of fact. That was his day job for a long time. And at nights, he can still be found haunting some of the Reno comedy clubs as a stand-up comedian. That's true. He warns me, though, that what he has to say this morning may not be funny. He does, however, think a good joke encapsulates a kernel of truth. So, but we'll see if he has any of those kernels of truth for us. He's very active in the community. He has volunteered as legal counsel for the Center for Adoptive Writing, as a board member for Reno Little Theater, and also for the Community Foundation of Western Nevada. He's active in the Rotary Club, Big Brothers Big Sisters of Northern Nevada, the Estate Planning Council of Northern Nevada. He's membership chair of, or at least has been, of the Young Professionals Committee, and he has served as general counsel for Northern Nevada Hopes, the community clinic on 5th Street. Many of you are aware of his essay on growing up Black in Reno, a very sobering article published in the RGJ, well, 3 years now. David tells me he's taken some time off from lawyering, and but no time off from comedy, right?
No, never.
David Gamble, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. It made me sound much more impressive than I am, I think. But I will always take it. So I think I asked who had read the article, and a couple hands went up. For the context of what I'm going to say, I would like to read the article in full. Hopefully I won't go on too long. And then I will talk about sort of the circumstances under which I wrote it, and why I wrote it, and sort of what I think since that time. So I released this in online in June of 2020. I think it was maybe like June 20th or something, 2020. I put it on my Facebook page after pondering whether I should do that at all. And then within about 2 hours, it had been shared 2,000 times. The Reno Gazette-Journal then called me and asked me if they could publish it. And of course, I said yes immediately. And then it went on from there to be shared on Facebook over 150,000 times. And I got overwhelmingly positive responses. There were some negative, but I got letters, emails from all over the world to people who said, I identify with this. Can I read this to my students? And so it was a great feeling for that to happen. And so this is the essay that I wrote. I grew up in Reno, Nevada. In 3rd grade, a boy confidently tells my brother and I that his mom said Black people cannot swim because our muscles are different than those of white people. In middle school, standing among a group of white classmates talking video games, I am the only Black child. One classmate expresses surprise that my family has enough money to afford a PlayStation. In high school, I am the only Black kid among a group of friends. When sharing drinks in my presence, they frequently tell each other not to N-word lip the bottles. Even though I object, they continue to use the phrase. In high school, my brother is a teen at a house party that gets broken up by police, a common occurrence. The kids at the party scatter, also a common occurrence. My brother, the only Black child in attendance, is the only one on whom a police officer draws a firearm to get him to stop running away. He is 14. In high school, a group of my white friends frequently sneak onto the outdoor basketball courts at an athletic club to play. They can usually play for hours, including with club members. On the 2 occasions I attend, club members complain and we are ejected from the club within minutes. In high school, I am excited about Black History Month and I'm talking to a friend about Black inventors. My friend snorts saying, Black people have never invented anything. In high school, as graduation approaches, many of my white friends tell me that I am lucky. They tell me that due to my skin color, I will get into any college I want. I remain in Reno for college. During college, an employer keeps food for employees in the break room refrigerator. One morning, I decide to have microwavable chicken wings for breakfast. The employer tells me I might not want to eat that for breakfast with my skin color. The employer immediately apologizes. In college, I am standing in a group of white friends on campus. A white acquaintance of one of my friends approaches to chat. The acquaintance tells a story about something that frustrated him and then reels off a series of expletives, ending with the N-word. None of my friends corrects him. In college, I visit an antique shop in Auburn, California with my girlfriend. The shopkeeper follows us around the store, whistling loudly as we browse until we leave. In law school, in San Diego, California, during a discussion in my criminal law class, a white classmate suggests that police officers should take suspects' race into account when determining whether there is reasonable suspicion to believe that an individual is committing a crime. Morning. No, if it wasn't you, I would have been late. So it's fine. The weekend of my law school graduation, my family comes to San Diego. I go to the mall with my brother and sister and visit the Burberry store. Two different employees follow us around the store, never speaking to us until we leave. After law school, I return to Reno. A coworker jokingly calls me King David upon seeing me each day. I joke that I am not treated like a king at work. The coworker then begins to call me Slave David each time we encounter one another. When I ask her to stop because it is hurtful, I am told that this is a problem that I have in my head. I attend a pub crawl with friends. We end up at a party in a hotel suite in downtown Reno. I am greeted by a white man at the door who loudly expresses surprise that I am, quote, an educated Negro, hearing me speak. I walk a friend who is a white woman from a restaurant to a car because it is nighttime. As we stand by the car chatting, a police officer pulls up and shines a light on us, asking if everything is okay. Once my friend confirms, the officer drives away. I tell her he was worried about her. He teasingly says, "Oh yeah, because you're so scary." Later, I tell another white friend I felt racially profiled by the officer. My friend shrugs and says, "I don't know, man, that's a stretch." A white friend tells me that white voters have become upset at Black people because of Black people's liberal use of food stamp benefits. When I point out that more whites than Blacks receive welfare benefits in the US, my friend expresses confusion as to how that could possibly be. I leave a downtown restaurant with my wife. As we walk along the river, a homeless man appears to be having a schizophrenic episode, engaging auditory hallucinations. Upon seeing me, he becomes lucid and begins to shout the N-word over and over. I discover that one of my clients does not want me to represent him as a public defender because he does not want a Black attorney. I am given the option to withdraw as counsel. I do not. Last year, I am at a barbecue chatting, and this last year is now 2019. So it's been a while. Last year, I am at a barbecue chatting with a white acquaintance who asks if I have ever experienced racism. When I say that it is a nearly daily occurrence, the acquaintance retorts without missing a beat, BS. 2 months ago, I am driving to lunch with the Black teenager I mentor. At a red light, a white woman crosses the street. As I begin to drive, she turns around and screams at us, "F you, you effing N-words." Before any of these instances, my family of origin moved to Reno, Nevada from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1984. My mother recently told me that my parents hired a company to remove a tree from our front lawn. 2 white men showed up and removed the tree. One of them carved a swastika into the stump. My father had to confront him and ask him to remove it. Before that, my now deceased grandfather, he died last year at the age of 94, served in the Army National Guard and was stationed in the US South. Despite being active duty, he was not allowed to eat in restaurants due to whites-only signage. He had to wait for fellow guardsmen to bring him food outside. Not long before that, my family were enslaved Americans, owned by Americans of English and Irish descent, which is why despite being primarily of African descent, I have an English last name. This is my experience of being Black in America. To be Black in America is to be told over and over that you are not good enough, that you do not belong, that you are genetically unfit, and that your physical presence is undesirable, and that everything about you, right down to your lips, is wrong. It is absolutely true that everyone experiences hardships in life, but the psychological weight of being told both explicitly and implicitly on a daily basis that your very existence is objectionable can at times feel unbearable. And despite this experience, I still love my country, my state, and my city. Despite my experience, I would not choose to be anything other than a Black American. The history of Black people in this country is one of struggle and triumph. Our people were brought to this country as slaves and against all odds, in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, have made our mark. Through slavery, poll taxes, literacy tests, redlining, and the black codes, we have persevered. Through the unspeakable horrors of mass lynchings, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and the massacre at Tulsa and Rosewood, we have persevered. I am an American of privilege, which makes me an African American of great privilege. I am an attorney. I live in a safe neighborhood. My children do not worry about their next meal. I can afford childcare. My family can afford personal vehicles. If my children become sick, I can take them to a doctor. If I am this privileged, and these have been my experiences, primarily in my own hometown, often with friends and acquaintances who are fond of me, and of whom I remain fond even now, just imagine what daily life must be like for a Black person in this country who does not enjoy my level of privilege. The protests in the streets of America were certainly about the killing of George Floyd, but not just about George Floyd. They were about the countless Black men, women, and children for whom the punishment did not fit the crime, if indeed there was a crime at all. We live in a country where, in order to recall what life under Jim Crow felt like, many Americans must pick up a history book. Meanwhile, many white Americans must pick up a history book. Meanwhile, many Black Americans need only pick up a telephone and call their parents. When we as people of color share our experiences, we are not doing so to score political points, to play the race card, to get sympathy, to assign blame, or to make you feel bad about yourself. We are asking you for help. We are asking you to join in the ongoing fight against racism in our country, because we cannot do it alone. It will take Americans of every stripe to eradicate racism from American society. I am now asking for your help. Please seek truth and knowledge. When sharing information, please check your sources and make sure that they are reliable. Try to place what is happening today into a historical context. Read about systemic racism and anti-racism. When your friends of color tell you that racism is real and affecting their lives, believe them. And then, if you can, do something about it. My children are likely to attend the same middle school and high school that I did. It is my great hope for them that the children with whom they attend school have knowledge, the compassion, and the guidance to know better than to daily deluge them with words that make them doubt their intelligence, their beauty, and their worth as human beings, based only on the color of their skin, and instead judge them by the content of their character. It is for all of the above reasons and so many more that we proudly say Black Lives Matter. And so that was the essay that I wrote at that time. What I would like to do now is sort of walk you through the sort of circumstances under which it was written, what was going on in the country at the time, and what I was feeling at the time that I wrote it. And so this is sort of a story that begins with actually speaking to my parents who were here this morning. My mom and dad. So, and it begins in June of 2020. On an idyllic spring afternoon in June of 2020, I found myself sitting with my parents in their living room, unexpectedly on the verge of tears. On May 25th, 2020, a video showing a 46-year-old Black man named George Floyd being killed by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin had gone viral. Floyd had been taken into police custody after he allegedly paid a store clerk with a counterfeit $20 bill. The killing was notable for two reasons. One was the method by which Chauvin had killed Floyd. The most widespread video of the killing, captured by a 17-year-old girl, quickly went viral, and the events it depicts are nearly unimaginable. The video shows Floyd lying face down on the pavement in handcuffs. Two officers hold Floyd on the ground, and despite Floyd's subdued position, Officer Chauvin pins him to the ground by kneeling with his knee on Floyd's neck as the minutes tick by. Floyd, by turns, tells the officer that he is having difficulty breathing, complains about the placement of the officer's knee, states, "I can't breathe," begs Chauvin to remove his knee, and finally calls out for his mother before ceasing to move. On the video, onlookers can be heard crying out to Chauvin, alternately begging him to relent and hurling insults at the officer in hopes that he might spare Floyd's life. Despite this, Chauvin persists, appearing to glare defiantly at the horrified spectators as his knee crushes the life from Floyd's body. Though initial reports stated that Chauvin had held his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, police body camera footage later confirmed the actual time to have been 9 minutes and 29 seconds. At Chauvin's murder trial, a pulmonologist would testify that Chauvin kept his knee on Floyd's neck for a full 3 minutes after Floyd died. The second reason the killing was notable was the race of the central figures. Floyd was Black and Chauvin is white. To say that race in America is a complex issue is a monumental understatement. From which families build generational wealth, to the quality of the healthcare one receives from their doctor, to the routes chosen when building the US interstate highway system, race is an ever-present subtext of American life. A 2020 study at Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that Black Americans are more than 3 times as likely as white Americans to be killed during encounters with police. Protests in Minneapolis, the city where Floyd lived and was killed, began immediately. On May 27th, the overwhelmingly peaceful protests erupted in violence when, according to Minneapolis police, a man with white supremacist ties smashed the window of an auto shop and set fire in an effort to foment racial unrest. Per police, the fire contributed to a chain reaction that led to days of street violence with clashes between police and protesters, culminating in the burning and destruction of the city's 3rd precinct police station. The events in Minneapolis set off months of international protests, which became synonymous with the Black Lives Matter movement, a social movement and organization which originated in response to the acquittal at trial of a man who had harassed and eventually shot and killed a Black child named Trayvon Martin as he walked home one evening. While initiated by and on behalf of Black Americans, the protests were supported by individuals representing every race and color. Accompanying these protests was a massive backlash. Some Americans had begun to display a naked racial animus, which I found previously unimaginable in my lifetime. In my hometown of Reno, the city where I grew up and which in many ways made me, a motorcycle was photographed in a convenience store parking lot. Affixed to it was a sign which read, "Black lives do not matter." Further, armed men flanked a silent vigil for George Floyd in downtown Reno. On television, in public, and on social media, people defended Chauvin's actions, attacked protesters, and denigrated Black Americans in the ugliest terms. It was at this point that I found myself at my parents' home, pouring out to them my disbelief over what was happening. My father recounted to me his memories of National Guard troops shouting at him to get inside the house in the aftermath of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s murder. He told me he believed that for the first time, I was likely feeling the full weight of what it meant to be Black in America. It made me recall a time in high school when there was a girl who liked me and I liked her. She was white, I am Black, and that didn't matter to either of us. We went on several dates, and when my father found out, he asked me whether I felt comfortable with her in public, whether we had encountered any untoward comments from strangers or noticed uncomfortable staring. I told my dad that we had not and wrote off his comments as those of someone who, unlike my generation, did not know that the ugly past of racism was largely behind us. I now realize that he had felt the full weight of what it meant to be Black in America, and he worried for his son. It was at this time that I began to notice, based on comments made to me, that some took my existence, a Black attorney and family man living in the so-called right neighborhood, running in the so-called right circles, as confirmation that racism was being blown out of proportion, and that those protesting in the streets had it all wrong. That is why I wrote what I did. There was never a time before that it felt safe to share what I shared in that essay. But at the moment, it felt absolutely necessary. I wanted to make sure that people understood that no matter one's social status of a Black person in American society, he or she will experience racism, and it will have an effect on their life. That I stood for Floyd and with the protesters. 3 years after the events of 2020, I find myself somewhat less hopeful and somewhat more cynical than I was before. Racial inequality remains high. Last year, police killings of civilians, including a disproportionately large percentage of Black civilians, reached a record high. Anti-Semitism, anti-Black, and anti-Asian violence are on the rise, and white supremacists in America remain emboldened. So what are we to do? There are two ideas which give me hope. And I will share with you, hopefully, a moment of levity. It's pretty heavy in here right now. So, and I'm sorry that this is the best display I have of it. This is a cartoon that I found right around this time. In the first panel, you can see an African man in chains being loaded onto what is a slave ship, no doubt. It says 1600s. Below the second panel, it states 1700s, and you can see a Black man working in a field with a hoe with a chain around his ankle, no doubt representing his bondage in slavery. The next panel states 1800s. You can see a Black man toting a bale full of cotton, no doubt remaining enslaved. The next panel states 1900s, in which you can see a Black man holding a card that states vote, with a police officer shaking a nightstick at him and a dog barking at him. Behind him, from a tree branch, you can see a noose hanging representing the dangers to Black men at that time, to Black people at that time. And in the final panel, which states 2000s, you can see a Black man sitting in a bar with a white acquaintance. Racial protests are on the television in the background, and his white friend is saying, "So what's your beef?" So that cartoon struck me as sort of very true. And so the first of two ideas, which continue to give me hope, is that we must learn from history. Americans, generally speaking, and I count myself in this statement absolutely, are woefully ignorant of history. There is a popular phrase, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. I prefer a slight variation, which states, those who fail to acknowledge history will never escape it. It seems that we are trying to run from it at the moment, and that is impossible to do. A coworker once asked me, and it was after I wrote the essay, a coworker asked me why Black Americans of African ancestry are often referred to as African American, but we do not use the phrase European American with the same frequency for white Americans. In a vacuum, it is understandable why the use of this terminology is confusing. However, if one knows of Bacon's rebellion, the picture becomes much clearer. To grossly oversimplify, the 1767 rebellion united white indentured servants with enslaved Blacks in a rebellion which managed to overtake the capital of Virginia and burn it to the ground. It was a result of this that laws were passed in order to treat Black and white inhabitants of the state differently, namely to treat Black inhabitants worse. This was a concerted effort to create division between the groups. In order to do so, the state began to label inhabitants as Black in the law, and thus created the racial distinctions that we use today. Only through understanding of history can we have a view of the full picture and therefore understand today's events in context. To illustrate the second point, I would like to recount a brief story. I have had the great fortune of having some wonderful teachers in Reno. My favorites were Claudia Rossi, who was my first, second, and third grade teacher when I attended a combined classroom of first, second, and third graders on the campus of UNR. My second and probably most favorite teacher is Joan Taylor, and she was my teacher in 5th grade at Elmcrest Elementary School. Jackie Riley is shaking her head. She knows Joan. And I became best friends with Mrs. Taylor's son. After my essay was published, Mrs. Taylor, as I will forever call her, contacted me and recounted a time in her class when the issue of race came up, and one of my white classmates expressed racist sentiments. We were fifth grade, so about 10 years old at the time. Upon contacting that student's father, his father reiterated the student's comments and ultimately removed the student from the class. When Mrs. Taylor contacted my mother in order to inform her of what had happened that day in the classroom, my mother, a devout Christian, stated, much to Mrs. Taylor's surprise, "I will pray for that boy." So what my mother understood is that we are all suffering, including my classmate. She understood that that child was not to be written off as irredeemably racist, but rather that he had been failed by his parents and had been failed by society, and that there remained hope for him and society at large. My mother's prayer was an act of faith and hope. What my mother knew, even in the face of potential harm to her own child, is that we must never forget one another's humanity. And if there is anything that gives me hope, and any lesson I hope that you take from this today, it is that. And that is the presentation that I prepared. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Specialty of coming into rooms and making people cry. That happens. I gave a speech at the governor's mansion last year where I made everybody cry. So it's not the role I want to play necessarily. But these are things that I think we must confront head on. And so I thank you very much for listening to that. And I would invite any questions. And I'm a huge fan of dialogue. I believe that we must have dialogue. And so please don't feel that any question is off limits or dumb or embarrassing. I'm open to answering anything.
I think most of us shared with you a perception until recent changes that racism was farther below the surface than it really was.
Yes.
And we're seeing a new need to confront it, deal with it, and certainly the movement to remove teaching of African American history in our schools on the pretext that it makes little white children feel guilty.
Yes.
It seems terribly phony.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
That the truth should hurt us so much.
Yes.
And so I think we're looking to you for that insight. What do we do? And any other comments or questions in the room?
Bob, one of our esteemed poets in this country, Robert Bly, used to say that he believed part of the problems we've had post-Vietnam is that we have never really truly grieved over that horrible, terrible war that we were involved in. And that makes me think of South Africa and post-apartheid. They attempted to do some grieving, I think, with the Reconciliation Commission. I think Nelson Mandela was involved in that. And that, of course, makes us think about this country. Back here, have you considered or thought about the idea of attempting to create some sort of a reconciliation committee in this country to allow some sort of better communication over our history of slavery?
I believe that's a great question. I believe it has been attempted in Congress. I believe the Congressional Black Caucus has, in every Congress recently, supported a bill which would create a commission to study the effects of slavery and also to study what it would take, if it is at all feasible, to institute reparations for slavery in America. That bill, needless to say, has really gone nowhere. And it does come to America's lack of an appetite to revisit the past. I think the commission in South Africa, it's great, and it's something that we need to do in this country. My wife and I visited Germany recently, a couple of years back, and we went on a walking tour in Berlin that it blew my mind. It was hosted by a German citizen. He was actually an art history professor, and he walked us around Berlin to various sites that were significant to World War II. And he explained to us the culture of Germany. And the culture of Germany post-World War II was such that the country had been brought so low that the dangers of nationalism were laid bare. Germans to this day will not even wave their flags at soccer matches because they are so afraid of nationalism and how out of control it can get. The other thing that they made certain to do was to teach their students, their children, in the clearest terms, what happened in Nazi Germany, what actually was done, and to make sure that they felt the appropriate disgust at that, and also to feel the appropriate amount of shame. And I think that's what we're probably running from here in America. I know that studies of Americans have shown that we value high energy and positive feelings. And that's true, we all do. I value high energy, positive feelings. I love that. But that also, I think, has lent itself to us avoiding anything that causes us emotional distress. And I don't know what could cause us greater emotional distress than being a past in which an entire class of people was enslaved and treated worse than another class, and the legacy of that continuing through today. And so, and I think that's where the rub comes in, is that we are, to a great extent, many people are pretending that what happened in the past was past, and that none of that has carried on to today. I spoke in 2020 to a white acquaintance of mine who had sort of a formulation that anything bad that had happened to me could not have been because of the color of my skin, and anything good that happened to me was because of the color of my skin. And so, you know, pointed out to me that this has not held you back. You became an attorney, but also there's affirmative action, and that's probably why you became an attorney. And, you know, I sort of pointed out to him, I attended a private law school in the state of California. And so private schools do not use affirmative action. And California actually, voters outlawed affirmative action in 1978 by vote, strangely, which is not something you would expect from California. But you can see sort of the mixed up thinking there. And that mixed up thinking is a product of our failure to have such a commission. I think your question was sort of whether I have considered attempting to do such a thing. I have not. And that is, you know, at this point, mostly what I have done is I speak to people and I write things. But underlying your question is that draw of direct action, of taking it a step further. And so I do appreciate that, and I will ponder it. Thank you.
I think Noam Chomsky summarized everything you just said, saying we actually, instead of the United States of America, has become the United States of amnesia.
Yeah.
And we don't want to go back there.
Yeah.
And now we have book burnings.
Yeah, we are banning books. We are burning books. We have actually passed laws to prevent students from learning about the past in America. And it's shocking. It's something I didn't think I would see in my lifetime, because it does sort of recall the 1930s in many ways, and an era that I thought was past. But, you know, as they say, the past is never really past. And I think that has been a shocking thing for me to learn. I think it really has turned my world upside down. Oh, and I'm sorry, I also meant to thank you for having me follow Frederick Douglass. That's a tough act to follow. So,
Thank you for
yeah,
your answer.
thank you for your question.
May I read a question from the chat?
Yes,
Okay, first, David, I just want to let you know that there are 25 people on Zoom. And so we have a really sizable audience here. And for everybody on Zoom, I found David's opinion piece in the RGJ, and I dropped that link into the chat, so you should have access to it. So here's the question from Penelope. Do you think that our increasing recognition of our harm to Indigenous people will help Black-white relations? And there's one more question, but Kevin, I'll let you tell me when to read the next one.
Okay.
uh,
Know if the increasing knowledge of harm to Indigenous people will help Black-white relations necessarily. And that is Indigenous Americans are a group that I think of often in terms of a population that has just been decimated, and the ongoing indifference to that decimation in America. And this was encapsulated for me once when I am married into a white family, and so I have many white family members, and one of them stated that Europeans were the first people in America, on the North American continent. And when it was pointed out to her that American Indians, as they were called, or Native Americans, predated that, she merely scoffed. There was no further arguments. There was no attempt to debunk what was said. It was just a scoff. And to me, that sort of showed the extent to which she did not even believe that she had to entertain the idea that Native Americans had some greater claim to this continent than anyone else. And so it would be nice if the increasing recognition of the harm that was done to Native Americans did help, I guess, Black-white relations. But really the thing is that it is going to be the knowledge generally of injustice that will help that. And it really doesn't come down to just Black-white, I think, because I understand following the release of my essay, my wife's uncle wrote on Facebook, when people say Black Lives Matter, what they mean is Black Lives Matter more. And that is truly frightening. And so I am not a Facebook arguing type of person. There is nothing to be gained from a Facebook argument. And so I reached out to him and I said, that's not what is meant. And I invited him to our house. I said, my wife and I, Leslie, his niece, would love to have you over to discuss this further. And he came over, and it was, I would not describe it as a productive discussion. And so, and in fact, he is the person who attributed all of my successes to being Black and none of that, and no negatives. And so that was interesting. But the thing that I took from that is that he is a furniture repairman. He has never been very wealthy. He has had a difficult life. And so I can certainly understand why he would come to my house in the suburbs of Reno, a nice neighborhood, where I'm an attorney and a family man, and say, what is holding you back? I completely understand why he would think that. But again, that is missing the forest for the trees. And so the fact that he could come into that situation and still purport to tell me that my experience as I related is wrong kind of shows the power that he believes that whiteness holds. And so it would be a matter of both education, but also understanding that that there is racial injustice, that there is economic injustice, and that we all need to find a way to come together essentially in order to fight injustice and inequality in all forms. And so I do not know if that answered the question, but that's as close as I can get, I think.
Jackie Riley had a question.
So So good to see. Paul and DJ, David. So my brother is married to a Black woman, 2 children, one very fair skin, one very dark skin. When your piece came out, I sent it to all of them. And was like, I'm kind of like, I'm sorry, and I get it. Amazing response that I got was, my brother was like, what's a micro? It's horrifying. My nephew, who is light skinned, went off on, this is all BS, essentially. My nephew, who is dark skinned, who lived with us for about 1.5 years, you might have met him. He had a completely different response. Wrote a 2-paragraph, no period flow that just blasted his brother, and I was like, how do you have those conversations with people? We also have here an anti-racist culture reflection group where we've read so far 3 books on Black experience. We just finished one on Indigenous experience. We're going to do another. Our attempt is to help all of us here understand and do better. I've asked some people why they don't participate, and they're like, which, I don't know, how do you get people to see? Your piece was so good, explained so much. And it was like, well, yeah. How do you get people to talk about that and to even engage? You tried with your uncle.
Yeah.
That's wife's uncle.
Yeah. That's so I think the piece I think was so successful in doing so because it told a story. And that is how we learn things. That is how people feel things, is through hearing a story presented in a dramatic way. And I was feeling very dramatic when I wrote it. So I think that is why it helped. And also there is a certain amount of anger that can be felt with the plight of African Americans and being an African American. I understand that. I have never found anger to be a useful emotion or a useful tool in persuading people. And that is my goal, is to persuade people. I'm also glad to hear that my family was not the only one that this piece blew up. So I had a similar reaction with my wife's family, where the piece came out and I spoke to her uncle and then I put this out. And her uncle initially commented on Facebook when I put it on. He said, "Oh, thank you for writing this, David. I get it. I will try to do better." And then within a couple hours, her uncle and one of her cousins had actually gone through line by line and pointed out why each thing that I said could not be true and wasn't a problem. And so there was that pullback, and it was, oh, I was so close. I mean, the question of how we have the conversations, in my experience, never with anger or judgment. That is, I try never to do it with anger or judgment. There's a book, and this is also another issue, sort of. There's a book, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with it or have read it. It is called White Fragility. Has anybody seen this book? And so the book basically, it is based on studies of a racial educator and her experiences. Essentially, the thesis of the book is that white Americans are so insulated from racial pressure, so rarely feel racial pressure, that any amount of racial pressure feels overwhelming. And she uses a few stories to illustrate this in the book. One of them is that she was brought into a workplace in order to do a diversity and race training. And one of the white women who was in the training became so uncomfortable that she thought she was having a heart attack. She had to leave the training. And what she points out is that this is sort of this is why you get sort of such outlandish reactions sometimes to what, to me, seems to be fairly vivid truth. if you look at history, to say you had a group of people who were enslaved, and then you denied them rights for decades and decades and continue to deny them rights, and they have worse outcomes now. It seems to be a straight line to me. And that is what I hoped to convey with the piece I wrote also, is look at this straight line from me all the way right back to slavery. And so I have found in speaking to my family members, my white family members, as well as white acquaintances that I have, that it can be difficult not to personalize that, not to feel accused and implicated in American racism. And yeah, quite honestly, we all are implicated in it, and we should be. I think it's the accusation, but what needs to be conveyed is that I am not ever saying that white people are bad writ large, or that you are to blame for what happened to my ancestors. But it is to say that white Americans to this day have benefited from that, and Black Americans have been harmed by that. And what we need to talk about now is what we do to fix that, to make amends, because that is what you do. That is the meaning of the term reparations. It is to repair something. And so it is quite difficult. And the thing that I've always said is that, ironically, it is my experience that has given me this knowledge to be able to share. But among many, well, not many, but among a certain sect or group of white people, my Blackness is evidence that I am biased. And so my great hope is always that white Americans will speak to each other. Jackie, your words with your family members will hold so much more weight than mine ever could, because you are more similarly positioned to them in their minds. And so that is my hope, is that white Americans will speak to one another about race. And certainly post 2020 with, I feel that I was naive about race prior to that, and prior to the 2016 election. And even former President Obama sort of said that he was a bit naive about the backlash that he would receive. And so I think to an extent we were all sort of shutting our eyes and playing our parts and hoping that it was okay. And then events occurred that allowed us to no longer do that. And so exactly what you did, please keep doing that. Please keep reading, keep sending these things to people who you know, and just keep at it, I suppose. It is painful, and it does, the conversation that I had with my wife's uncle certainly harmed our relationship. And I tried to I hope that I'm presenting today as a pretty steady person, pretty calm, that's generally how I try to speak to people. And it was just, he was so incensed by the things I was saying, because they were so out of sync with what he believed and with what he wanted to believe, that he became enraged. He left my home red-faced, and we have not been able to reconcile, unfortunately. And so, quite honestly, he has not sought to reconcile, and so that is sort of the issue. And so, in doing these things, you will make people angry. You might lose the ability to speak with certain family members, but that is the pain that we have been avoiding that stops us from getting to where we need to go.
I do love I also have a biracial niece, and she and my 3 children give me hope.
Yeah.
Because they get it. My niece sends me stuff about woke issues all the time, which cracks me up.
Yeah,
and I love it.
Yeah.
So we have great dialogue with them.
Yeah.
I'll keep working on my brother.
Well, and it was also, yeah, exactly. It was also interesting that your 2 nephews had such different experiences. And that is a real thing. My children are fairly fair-skinned. If anything, you would think my son was Latino. That is what he's like, slightly brown. And my daughter is more visibly African American, but not to such an extent that her peers pick her out as necessarily immediately African American. Meanwhile, my older sister's children are very visibly African American, dark skinned. They have had many more experiences with racism at their young age than my children have. My children learned last year, I believe. Yes, last year, heard the N-word for the first time ever. And that is, my son was 6 at the time, my daughter was 9. And so that is quite far into their lives, actually, for the first time to hear that word. When I told my sister that, she was shocked. She said that her children had heard that years and years before. And so that is sort of the thing, is that you will receive disparate treatment. And it is a privilege of my children that they made it that far into their lives without knowing that term. And so it makes sense to me that your nephews had such different experiences. And your one nephew had sort of the angry response. I understand the anger. I understand the anger. And I don't want to ever pretend that I don't understand it. And that it is not to be felt. But after that, I think we have to try to find a useful way to move forward.
Michelle has another question from the
Yes.
chat.
I
box.
do, and we also have some words of gratitude coming into the chat that I would like to read first, if that's okay.
Sure.
David, please, this is from Matt. Please continue to document ongoing racism. So many of us all have relegated racism to the past. Our naivete needs to be exposed, as you are doing. And then from Lloyd, he wanted to echo Jackie's comments. And then he says, I am very moved by, David, your mother's perspective on the very difficult concept of trying to be understanding of people whose public behaviors are abhorrent to our view of the inherent worth and dignity of all. My knee-jerk reactions to racial indignities are not enough. We need to always be involved in the struggle to teach the past and participate in the effort for universal humanity going forward. And then I know we're at 10 o'clock, Kevin, so we may not have time for this last question, but I will read it anyway. This is from
We have 2
Robin.
minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Well, you're the timekeeper. So David, when you encounter a discriminatory comment from someone in your everyday life, how do you respond? Do you respond differently to a child or a young adult or an adult? Do you ever just let it pass? If so, does it depend on how you think your response will be received?
To that question, I say yes. So, yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and the way that I respond has changed. But yes, generally, growing up here in Reno, being quite often the only or one of a few Black people around, I very quickly found that that many of my friends did not have the same perception as me. And therefore, I did not find it worthwhile to talk about racial slights. And so there are many instances in which you sort of have to, you just let them pass or you move on. There's an author, I want to say it's Brian Stevenson, who's an attorney. And he told a story once of walking into a courtroom and the judge telling him that defendants were not allowed into the courtroom yet. And he's clearly the attorney, he's there to defend a client. And so he talked about what he did was he explained to the judge, oh, Your Honor, I'm actually counsel, and then made a joke, and they all laughed at it. They all kind of laughed about what had just happened, and they moved on. And he said that's not what he wanted to do in that moment, but he understood that if he made that a larger deal, it could prejudice the judge against his client. And that's the situation in which I and many Black Americans find themselves regularly, is that you have to move forward in society. on a daily basis. When I got married to my wife, who is, well, actually, when I began dating my wife, who is white, man, she was on alert for racism. She was calling everyone out with anything that happened. And I appreciated that. That's great. But I told her, like, I can't do that. I have to live my daily life. I have to go forward. And if I did that, what percentage of my day and my life would be spent just calling people out and getting in fights with people? And so sometimes you do just let it pass. And I certainly, yes, absolutely. I respond differently to children, to young people, because the thing of my essay is that many of the people that I grew up with, many of those instances in school, it was that the children did not know better. And so that is not their failing, that is the failing of society. And the other thing that I do is I respond differently when I know that people are not expressing animosity, but rather merely sort of a benign ignorance. When people genuinely don't know how to ask me something or how to say something to me and say it in an inartful way, but that I can tell that they are not attempting to harm me. There's no reason to respond to that with aggression. It is annoying sometimes, and it is irksome. But there's no reason to push that person away. And so hopefully that answered that question.
David, I'm struck that you really recognized the racism in our society relatively late in your life.
Yes, yeah.
In contrast to your father's experience. And as I reflect on my own family, my grandmother's horror at the racism of the generation before her own racism, my mother's lesser racism, and I hope my lesser racism. It seems to me that there is a generational evolution going on. And so I wonder how many more generations do we have to go before it's no longer a factor in society and people's fates?
Yes, 5.
Five.
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. It is one of those things I was thinking of, and speaking to someone last night about the quote that gets often attributed to Dr. King, but I know it predated him, about the arc of justice.
Oh, yes, yes.
Being, or the arc of the universe being long, but
our own justice. Theodore Parker.
There you go. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Oh, amazing. So, yes. Oh, really? And so that is the question. And I think that the realization that I've come to is that I don't believe that I'm going to see the end of racism in my lifetime. And I thought I might. I saw an African-American president far before I thought I ever would in my lifetime. And at that point, I just thought, well, it's all uphill from here, you know, it's all roses from here. And I did not understand well enough, as I'm speaking about even now, I did not understand well enough history. I did not understand that such progress is always met with a dramatic backlash. And so, but I will say also that, yes, each generation there does seem to be an improvement, and that does give me hope. It gives me great hope. We had a babysitter who, when we moved onto our street, she lived up the street from us. She's a white girl. She went to Reno High, which is the high school I attended. And she had so much more knowledge and awareness about racism and how to treat people, and political knowledge, quite frankly, than any of us had when I was 17 years old. We were not concerning ourselves with that at all. And it almost seems that for many in that generation, it's become a necessity, that they have realized that these problems are not getting solved, and the sooner they start, the better. And so with each passing generation, I do think that it gets better and better. I think that my own life is evidence of that. I think that I was born probably at the best time to be a Black American so far. And I think it will only get better and better and better. I think it has gotten better. My daughter was born in 2012 into an America that had a Black president. So, and so it does get better and better. And so that is a reason to hope.
Good, good. Well, David, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes afterward to chat with folks,
Yeah.
and meanwhile, we are very grateful for your coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone on Zoom.